Welcome, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Hope you're hydrated, hope you're enjoying yourselves. Appreciate you joining me for this very unusual subject. I'm surprised you're all here, but that's great. Let's talk about it. My name is Ross Matsuda. I'm an Apple Systems Administrator with an MSP named Antiva. We work with a lot of small, medium business, a couple enterprise clients, a lot of places around the States and a couple abroad. I am also, in my downtime, a stage director. I direct opera, musical theater, stuff like that when I can. Thank you kindly. Live music, support live music. But my work with that sort of puts me in a weird spot of having a huge appreciation for the technology we work with, but also a huge appreciation for the human element, right? So like what that user experience is, how we can really maximize that while at the same time keeping ourselves sane. Speaking of things that question our sanity, let's talk about GUI scripting. For the uninitiated, GUI scripting, graphic user interface scripting, unsurprising enough. The goal of this sort of script, and there's lots of different ways to execute it, is to simulate user action, right? So we want to be able to tell the mouse to go to a certain spot on the screen or to find a certain element on the screen. We want to start hitting keys on the keyboard without needing to tell our user how to do it. We just want to run that stuff for them so that we can focus on other things, that they can focus on other things. For today's purposes, we're going to be talking all in AppleScript, which means we're also going to be using Script Editor. So ta-da, you have all the software you need for it built into your Macs. You'll love to see it. And most importantly, when we talk about what GUI scripting is, it is a terrible idea. This will be a running theme throughout the day. Please do not forget that everything I'm going to tell you today is still at its heart a pretty terrible idea. Now, why is that? Let's say we've got a client. Client comes to you, we have a new security measure we need to put in place. There's a metric we need to control, and we need to turn off Bluetooth sharing. Okay, one person, go ahead and open up system settings, and we'll get into the general section, get into sharing. We're going to scroll down there until we see that item for Bluetooth sharing. We're going to click that slider off. Congratulations, you're now secure. No, you're not. We're administrators. We do things like this because these controls are how we prefer to work and, to be entirely frank, how we should be working until hopefully there's MDM controls for that. I think we're all very excited for the fall. But using commands like this, throwing a defaults command up there, editing the setting, done. Now we can take what we just did with that one user, we can scale it out. This is all 101 stuff. You know where we're at. The reason that we have to talk about this, though, is because what if we're in a world where the control we want doesn't exist? What if this command line tool for this specific setting wasn't available to us? What are we supposed to do then, especially when we need to start talking about scale? So let me walk you through a couple examples of some workflows. This is going to lay some groundwork, and then we're going to talk about why this is important and how we're going to deal with it. First thing, what if we need to set an incredibly obscure preference key inside of Word? Right, something that's not part of their MDM spec. We've poked around on Stack Overflow. We're not exactly sure where this stuff is saved. How do we start? So if we're talking to a user, we're going to tell them to open up Word however they want to open it. Find it in the dock, find it in Applications, find it in Spotlight, launch the sucker, wait an indeterminate amount of time, spoiler alert. Eventually, we're going to see this window, right? The app has loaded. We know that it's interactive. Once we're there, we can tell the user to go into Settings, click on the menu item, or hit Command, comma, for those of you who are feeling saucy. And we're going to end up here. Now that we've got this pop-up, we're going to go into the spelling and grammar section. Give that a click. And now we've got a unusually crowded window, but that's still fine. All the way at the bottom, we're going to tell our user there is a settings button. Go ahead and get over there. Give that a click as well. We have yet another popover with more indecipherable text. You'll love to see it. Down at the bottom, two identical drop-down menus, both that say don't check, because of course they do. We're going to tell the user to look for the one that talks about spaces. That's what they want to do. Get your mouse over there, give that a click. Suddenly we see what we're looking for, right? Mouse down to where it says 2 spaces, select that. We're not done yet, though, because even though we've made our setting selection, until we actually click OK, this hasn't been written to disk. This hasn't been saved. Hit OK. Now this is our end state, right? The user interaction is done. The setting has been changed. It's been saved to disk. We're ready to move on. Another example. Everyone loves connect to server bookmarks. How can you not? Let's say we're in a situation, you're in a mature environment. You've got dozens of employees, you've got devs, they have a huge list of servers they're used to hitting, network shares, homes, all that stuff. We need to add a couple new endpoints to that without overwriting what's already there. All right, that sounds like fun. Go ahead and click on your desktop background, watch all your windows disappear to the side for some reason, file feedback. Go ahead and hit Command K to bring up your connect to server window. All right, we're going to start here. We're going to tell the user, now there's a text field up here. If you move your mouse over it, that's where we're going to begin. If you've been using this a lot in the past, chances are there's some text there. And if there is, you're going to want to delete it because we're going to give it some new information. Go ahead and click that text field. We're going to type in our address. Great. And then we have to go down to a little plus button down here, give that a click, and congratulations. We're either done at this point, now this is our end state, or if we're in a situation where we need to map 6 new server favorites. Okay, let's loop the process, and we got to keep going back to that initial state. We got to keep going into that text field, deleting what's there, retyping the new content, kicking it out, and hitting that plus button to save it. Now, automating this, the reason that we use this thing that, again, is still a terrible idea, is because it's going to allow us the ability to control things that ordinarily couldn't be controlled, period. Right? We've exhausted our resources and our expertise. We've talked to everybody here on Slack. They're ignoring you because this doesn't make any sense. And if we don't have MDM configs for it, we need some way to make this work. So this is really the biggest definition of in case of emergency break glass. Right? We're doing everything we can to not have to write like this. However, for these sorts of workflows where ordinarily you need to contact your users and walk them through 20, 30-minute phone call sometimes, right, to go through all these steps, especially if you're a one-person house, that's a lot of time, especially if you've got to repeat these steps. So you can save yourself a ton of time if you are the support desk, or if you have a help desk you're interacting with, they are going to love it if you can put this thing into something that's very repeatable, that requires very little coaching from them to get ahead of something before the support ticket gets created. And pros. That's pretty much it. Which means now I get to talk about the fun part, which is all the reasons why, again, this remains a terrible, bloody idea. GUI scripting is incredibly fragile. Right? This is unsurprising. It's unlike a lot of the other code that we write, it's incredibly vulnerable to the passage of time. Because normally, if we're copying files, if we're downloading something, if we're pushing out PowerPoint templates, right? We're doing that for an organization. The only time we're really concerned about is how long it takes to download. That's our variable. When we're dealing with GUI scripts, suddenly we are mimicking keyboard and mouse work. That's closer to real time for a user, right? And what are they doing during that time? What background processes are running that could interfere with what's happening here? And we're going to get to this a little bit later, but what happens if they start clicking into different applications and what you're expecting your script to run in? So we have to deal with time. We have to deal with user input. For all of you playing the home game, these things are incredibly operating system specific, which means that not only is this workflow kind of complicated to get started, but once you've got it built, you've got to make sure that it works in however many major operating systems you're handling in your environment. Right? If you've got a small team, maybe everyone's running Ventura right now, great, less work, much more sustainable. If you're an MSP and you have many clients who you will not pry their 2011 iMacs out of their cold dead hands, you kind of need to broaden the amount of versions this you're going to have to build. And you're not just thinking about major OS versions, right? Because we've got features that are getting deprecated. We got features that are getting added mid-life cycle. So suddenly you have to test 12.3.1 and later, and before, even though we're really hoping no one's running 12.2 at this point, it's a whole other can of worms. Not only are we dealing with OS specificity, but you can use this interacting with third-party software. That's why I wanted to bring up the example of Word. This isn't just Apple-only stuff. We can use this to start hitting third-party apps, which suddenly means you are not only testing multiple operating systems and operating system versions, you are also testing different versions of the third-party software you have to interact with, and that entire Punnett square, right, of every possible combination. You're going to need to control for this and make sure that if a user uses this tool, which we have all agreed is a terrible idea, if they click that button and they expect something to happen, it's going to happen. Or or nothing's going to happen, right? Much better for it to fail and stop before it begins than to leave your user in sort of a hung state, especially if you're doing something like changing file or user account permissions. Honestly, this is just I can only really call this specific because we're not feeling very verbose right now. Everyone's favorite game, Spot the Difference. Welcome to system settings, where the points don't matter. 2 iterations of our software update preference pane. You'll love to see it. You'll notice that there's a couple key changes here. In the top left corner of our first window, we've got that back button. What does that mean? That means we navigated here by going into the General tab, Software Update. Boom, now we've landed. You'll love to see it. Speaking of that little sidebar there, Okay, so we've got a different path there. We have a different item highlighted in each of those. Now, the bulk of what we actually care about looks pretty much the same. You know, we see the updates available, we've got our settings, we've got the more info button, all that jazz. But when it comes down to what we want to execute, and for this example, let's say we want to hit that Update Now button. Well, because this is a terrible idea, those two buttons don't have the same target. If you write a script and that's going to work on one of these, it will not work on the other. Because the way that we navigated to this place, the way macOS drew these windows and these tabs changes the eventual target. Right? So we're dealing with a really complex child and parent relationship. And this degree of specificity, once again, is why we will spit into the void and do this anyways. So, while we're being sociopaths, let's talk about your prerequisites. Your first prerequisite is you have made the decision to do this anyways. And I really do it anyways. You have exhausted your resources. You've wasted countless hours trying to find any way in the world to not leverage this skill set. And yet here we are. Great. As far as your testing is concerned, this is your most important first step. Right? Because as we talked about, this stuff is very fragile, it's very specific, and if you don't control for a lot of these things, you're gonna run into trouble, and you're gonna cause trouble for your fellow employees, your developers, and worst case scenario, your users who are now going to absorb those support desk hours that you really need to be doing other things with. Going down the list of stuff that's important here, let's talk about if you can run this in a virtual machine or not. Right? A lot of things, especially some basic software stuff, of course you're going to run this in VMs, and you can roll back your states, you can do whatever you need to, that's lovely. But based on the environment, and because you can use this for just about bloody anything, what happens if there's an external display involved? Is your behavior going to change if your user has a dock? Right? So you have to confirm that if there's a battery detected inside of your computer, what are the things that you need to confirm or you expect, I should say, to be present during your testing workflow so you can control for it and make sure it actually executes. We already talked about operating system targets, right? It's major and minor if what you're working on was revised in the middle of a product's life cycle. Your app targets, also important. And just like operating system, depending on your unique environment and the needs for this sort of script, what can you expect folks to have installed? Do you have Microsoft Auto Update taking care of those patches for you? Are you doing it through a public library that's provided by your MDM? Or is it the Wild West? Do you need to be able to control for older versions of those apps if they have the same file path where you generally find them and launch them? Something that can get a little bit trickier, user account settings. It's very possible that users, because we are mimicking user input, some things behave a little bit differently when you've got voiceover turned on. And certainly a lot of things are going to behave a little bit differently if your users on the savvier side of things and they've started customizing their own keyboard shortcuts. Suddenly those things that we sometimes take for granted when we're building this are not really going to behave the way we want. Identify these edge cases as they apply to your environments, and can we test for that? Is there a way programmatically to pull that information so that we can tell, all right, if we try to send this command, there's no override for it, we know it's going to land the way we want it to land. Other possible constraints, will it run online, will it run offline? Do you need to have intranet access, right? Especially when we're dealing with things that are involving network access. Will the script fail if it's unable to find a certain asset on your network? Another thing that I'd recommend, because this can be used in more complex workflows that involve changing file, folder, or user permissions, what do you do if a user gets halfway through your script and pulls the plug? Are they permanently an admin? How do you control for this, right? And so these are, because we're dealing in almost real time with our user base, we need to be really, really careful with what we assume they can or won't do during the runtime. Once you've sussed all that out, it's worth mentioning and considering how we're going to get this to our users, right? So one way that is pretty straightforward is going to be putting together an AppleScript application. After you write the script, you've got everything built, you're ready to go. You can go into the File menu, Export, and when you're ready to kick this thing out, you can set your file format to application. This is just going to build a .app with your script wrapped inside of it. It's got all the basic infrastructure you'd expect inside of that app. It's really, really powerful for sharing. If you're building a tool that you want to share with the rest of the community, right, just bundle this thing up. Get out there for people to use. This can also be very helpful if you are in, and I'm sorry if this is your situation, if you're in an environment where you are managing multiple MDMs simultaneously. So if you got most of your devices in Jamf, but a handful and adage of one client that loves kanji and will not leave them alone, building a single application for this so you know the parent process of your script is always going to be the same, even in these disparate environments, that can really save you a lot of time and especially troubleshooting once you get that rolling. Other than bundling an application, you can also just dump this script inside of what you've already got, right? So just throw in an OSA script call. We've got those EOD tags, and just copy and paste your stuff right in there. This can be really, really helpful if you have a more homogeneous environment, right? You know everything's going to be launched by the same parent process, that application, agent, or binary from your MDM. And we need one set of permissions to make this thing work. Great. Speaking of that, everyone's favorite 4 letters in the room. Yay. 2 keys, 2 payloads we really want to take care of here. And let's start with the easier one first. For those of you who have not built a lot of these, welcome, enjoy, good luck, Godspeed. An accessibility payload, all we really care about here are 4 most important keys. We have our identifier type. This is how we're going to figure out how we're going to tell the OS this is what we need to manage, is what we're keeping an eye out for. The identifier itself, here I'm using an example. This is a script I wrote a while ago called loading available updates. Cool, bundled that up. You have your code requirement, which is those additional details that just really makes bloody well sure, no, we're talking about the same application, even if there's some duplication in possible identifiers. And we have set the allowed string to true. So we want this thing to be able to do what it needs to do and step in for the user and act. Now, if you're like me, and you do not want to type this by hand, Jamf has your back, says the guy who doesn't work in a Jamf environment. PPPC utility is money in the bank. This piece of software is spectacular. I cannot recommend it enough. Allows you to do a lot of things really, really fast, right? And that's what we like. So in the left side there, we've got a list of applications. Starts out blank, and you can just pull in the application that you want to give access to do the thing. In this case, we're just testing out with terminal to see what we get. And once you've done that, now look, there's our bundle identifier. No additional work required, nothing in CLI. You can just drag this thing in, get the information you need, and keep moving. Furthermore, underneath that, we have got our code requirements, again, right in the same spot. You can just triple-click it, copy it, get it where you want. And below that, we have our accessibility set to allow is set to true. So boom, that's all the things we needed in the previous PPPC generated in the GUI. We can, of course, export this and get it into production if we need to. But wait, there's more. It slices, it dices, it juliennes, fries, system events. This is the other payload that we care about. It's all built into the same interface, which is very convenient. If you're running this at home, you just go to that plus button at the bottom of this column, hit that, and it allows you to add the system events payload to this item. And we've got that in place, but more interestingly, we've also got Word. Right? Now, this is something a little bit less expected. Why is this present? We've talked about the accessibility payload. Let's talk about what makes a system events payload unique. So, same basic infrastructure, especially at the top, fundamentally identical. Identifier type, identifier, code requirement, allowed set to true. You'll love to see it. We got something special down here. So we have another iteration of these keys to identify an application, binary, or process, and that is now appended with AE receiver, Apple Events Receivers. Apologies to the room if I got that acronym wrong. We have fun here. We're setting the bundle ID as our identifier type. We have the receiver, and again, this is just all the information, the identifying information for the app that we are going to act upon. So we know who's sending control, and in this situation, it's that loading available updates application, and we are sending our commands over to system preferences in this particular instance. So, you've collected some basic data, you've got your prerequisites, now we get to go to work. And this may be terrifying for some people in the room, but you got to put on that hat again that maybe you thought you left behind a while ago. And we get to pretend that we're walking a user through this on the phone. And when you're walking a user through something on the phone, the first thing you got to do is start with your device state. What's open, what's closed, what's installed, what's not, right? So if any information that you can gather about where you expect this to need to be run, get that down so you know where you're beginning. Once you've got your device state settled, you're going to be delivering detailed instructions to your rubber duck or other listening party. No shortcuts. Go through these steps as if you're walking through a really inexperienced user, someone you really need to take care of, or a C-level, right? Just take nothing for granted at this step in the workflow. We've just got to make sure that we don't skip anything that could cause us problems later. Once we've gotten through that, we need to identify our final interactive step, the last thing that we tell the user to do. And in your environment, that might be, changing the setting, or clicking OK or Apply to save the setting, or even quitting an application afterwards if you want to make sure that the user doesn't touch anything else in there. Doing something like this in directory utility would be a little bit terrifying, to just leave that open and potentially unlocked. Once we've gotten through that spot, now we can start having some fun with this. Now you can flex a little bit harder. If we were talking to one of our colleagues, how would we explain this to them, right? What can we pull out and say, oh, there's a better way to open this. There's a faster way to get to this spot, right? Start cleaning up your instructions that will take advantage of those particular tools and workflows. Next, we're seeing what can we handle with our usual languages. If you're used to working in Bash, if you're working in Z Shell, see what you can say, all right, I know how to open this, I know how to get here, et cetera, and we're popping out those items all under the auspices of, we want to use the Apple script in this for as little as possible, right? Because this is the most fragile part of our code, and especially if you don't do this on a regular basis, congratulations, you're living your life correctly. We want to keep it that way. And so we want to use this for just the tiniest bit. And it's really common, right? You found those workflows where it's like, there's one click. There's one thing that I couldn't do using my existing tools, right? And that's the kind of stuff we're trying to solve for here. So, for today's shenanigans, everyone's favorite task, going into the software update preference pane and clicking the More Info button. Drum roll, you know it, you love it. I am talking through a user on the phone how to do this. Great, go ahead and go up to the Apple menu, click System Settings, give it a second to load. Once it does, you'll find yourself in the Appearance tab for no apparent reason. Once you're there, right above that, we're going to have a General button, right? We're going to go to the General section, and then near the top of the resulting list, we have Software Update. Go ahead and give that a click. Might take a hot second. We've got an activity indicator spinning. It takes a look around and sees what's available. So we've let that load. Check it out. An available update. Now, user will see a couple different state changes here, and that includes, now we've got that software update available 1 badge, over on the left. We did not direct the user to go to that immediately because we weren't 100% sure if the Mac saw that yet, right? And because we couldn't guarantee that when we started our workflow, we were going with the more consistent path, even if it takes an extra step or two, right? Once we're there, we can mouse on down to this little More Info button, give that a click, and suddenly we are at this glorious interface that I miss dearly. We have the update that's available, we have details on it, we have a single install button, and it makes it very clear to the user, here's what's actionable. You should probably go ahead and click that and get our process started. Couldn't really play with it here, but everyone who was with us for the update to Ventura and many other macOS major upgrades in the past know how much fun it is trying to explain to users the difference between a macOS upgrade banner and the update link for your security updates. Using a workflow like this, you can drop your user off in a state where they can't select the wrong option. Right? If you're trying to make sure that they can run a security patch but not accidentally bump themselves up to a version of software of the OS that's incompatible with business critical apps, they can't mess this up. That being said, I think it is worth noting that in macOS Ventura, I originally built this in macOS Big Sur, that More Info button is not actually a valid accessibility target right now, nor is it in in macOS 13 Plus. If you see possible value in perhaps nudging our favorite development team to address that, I will leave this completely random string of letters and numbers on the screen for a moment so you can do with that what you will. So we've got our workflow, right? We've identified the things we want to do. We know our end state. We know our start state. We've cleaned up our interface, we've cleaned up our instructions to have as few steps as possible using our knowledge as admins. So we now need some nouns to verb. So let's find them. go through your list and find out what is the first thing that you can't handle with command line interface. What's the first thing that all right, we've hit a little bit of a roadblock. In this workflow, we opened System Preferences, we went to the General tab, we went to Software Update. Those of you playing the home game once again, ta-da! So you can just one-liner this to get yourself straight into system settings, and this is tested and operational in, once again, macOS 13 Plus. Great. So we've gotten through that part of our workflow. That's where we land ourselves. And now we need to figure out what all of these things are and how we can talk to them. You're going to go into Script Editor, and we're going to run this lovely little command. Slides will be available at the end, but feel free to type quickly. The clatter is somehow relaxing to me. And as most of our Apple script tells are going to go, we've got a couple steps. We are telling system events. More often than not, you're going to find that everything starts at system events. Right? So we start that tell. We are then going to tell the window, the front window of a specific process. Here we're doing system settings. This can be whatever you want. Right? And then we're going to define a variable, UI elements in this case, to the entire contents of said window. Relatively straightforward. And as mentioned, you can just customize that second line to whatever application that you're dealing with today. Once you run this, you're going to get some darling input in your Results tab. Isn't it beautiful? It's great because we've got some formatting applied to it, right? We've got some colors, we've got some bold, we have some italics on things. But you can't really read this super well yet, but that's assuming you can read it at all, because this is option B. And I think we are all familiar with these assistive requirements. So in case we had forgotten, yes, this is still a terrible idea, but we know what to do for these. Right? So back into system settings, we're going into privacy and security, getting into accessibility, hitting the magic slider, relaunching our app, and now we're back. So from here, what I would strongly recommend, and this is the workflow that works for me, the next screen is going to trigger some people in the room. Oh no, it's text edit. What have I done? Oh no, it's rich text. Please get out of the building. The reason I'm doing this in rich text is because I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of the formatting that Script Editor gave us. Right? So like you can do this however you want. This is just what works for me, at least for the moment, and especially as I was getting used to reading the syntax, I found it helpful, right? Little bonus cues. So let's clean this up. Let's make this a little bit less terrible. And the good news about this is that all of this text is comma separated. So y'all know the drill from here. We are going to run a find. We're going to search for commas or comma space, as whatever floats your boat. Check that replace box, and we are going to replace our commas or commas and spaces with some carriage returns. If you just hit the return key in there, nothing will happen. If you hold down the option key and hit return, you're adding a non-breaking space, and that's going to be a text element that this interface actually knows how to work with. So we are replacing our commas or commas and spaces with a pair of carriage returns. We are going to click that all button, because we don't want to replace just one, but the whole darn thing. And this suddenly got a whole lot easier. Once you have this built, you can see that we've got a lot of individual items. These are mostly non-interactive elements. More on that in a moment. But while you were going through this, and apologies, I did not test this in other localizations. As far as I can tell for the moment, especially when working in US English, this stuff is left to right, top to bottom. Okay? So we can expect that the static text element screen time is rendered before the next row that shows up, and then so on, so forth. A quick reminder as you are doing this, part of the user interface elements that will show up in this list will include what we call static text entries, which just block a text that might be in your window. If that text had commas in it, you're about to have a weird time looking for it, so just bear that in mind that you'll see some weird stuff, especially as you find those elements. Let's pull out one of these and take a slightly closer look. And this, blessedly, is relatively straightforward. We've got a noun. We have a static text element, and then we have a descriptor or identifier for that. In this case, this is the actual text that's written in the window. Then this all goes child of parent of parent of parent of parent, right? So the static text is a child of group 3, which belongs to a scroll area, which belongs to another group, et cetera, et cetera. As you scrub through this, you will finally start seeing something useful. We've got a window name, window software update of the process, system settings, and then once again, everything owned by system events, okay? So we're following this. Let's find that in our user interface. So Apologies, I know this text is small, but there is only so much screen real estate to go around. Hey, look, use the software as subject to, etc. Okay? We've now found some way to ground ourselves as we try to read through the rest of this and make sense of what lives where. So we found this static text element. We know that this static text element is a member, or is a child, of group 3. And what does that mean? What do we have 3 of? In this scroll view, that's the element that we're dealing with on the right side of software update, we've got 3 of those little, like, slightly darker rectangles. Those, in the user interface realm of this stuff is concerned, those are our groups, okay? So we know that this static text element lives inside a group, so it's going to be inside one of those, not outside of it. We know what to look for. We found it there. Where does group 3 originate? Well, because we're going top to bottom, unsurprisingly, it is drawn by the OS right before it's populated, right? So it builds the group, builds the container, then drops the items inside of it. Let's say we wanted to find the question mark button right afterwards, right? So logically, we're going to keep going down. And there's a little sucker. And you notice we've got that text down there, button 1 of scroll area 1. This is not a member of group 3. This is not a member of any group. And so we know that that element's going to be outside of those darkened rectangles, which is going to help us find it and pick it out of a crowd. Now, every developer can do this totally differently. System settings is everything's based on numbers. Here we are in word preferences. And boy, that's a sight for sore eyes. Behold the majesty of actually naming the elements in your user interface. We have a group. The group's name is visible. It's authoring and proofing. It's right there. The buttons have identified. We could shuffle these buttons around, and in theory, even if they're drawn in a different order, the button named General should still take you to the General tab, right? And that's what we can expect. Anyone who's writing something using Swift, like, please do the thing. We will love you very much if you do the thing. And this is purely conjecture on my part, but I would choose to believe that a developer that is taking the time to name these elements when they're drawing them up is likely not going to change them accidentally, right? It's not like, oh, we moved something over a slot, suddenly button 1's button 2. General is always going to be general. View is always going to be view, right? So keep an eye out for this when you're working with certain applications. We're not going to dive into Chrome too terribly much, but just as a heads up, if you were to run this on Chrome, I haven't checked the other Chromium browsers, but I believe them to be structurally the same, your output is going to be enormous. And part of that is because I was delighted to find your bookmarks toolbar is always there, even if you can't see it. So it's still loaded into memory. It still has those GUI targets, but you just can't see it until you toggle the thing on and you can get in there. Also of note, all I'm talking about today is working with application contents. Using this workflow on a web browser, it gives you all of the UI elements you can deal with except the web view. So different task entirely. If there's some that you know you have to load up a certain website, click on X, Y, and Z, this workflow is not going to be your cup of tea. All right. Note, drink. So far, so good. Acting on targets. We have our workflow. We've got our nouns. Now, how do we make sure that the nouns we've got are actually what we expect them to be? Because all we did in the last one is try to understand what they probably are. Best way to test this out is to actually call them. So we are going to send some clicks. We're going to start the same way we did before, with the basic tell to system events to start the ball rolling. We're going to then send a tell to, in this case, system settings or your target application of choice. And we are going to click and then just dump the UI elements identifier that we found in our previous step. Right? So you can find those. Whenever I'm working on one of these, I'll include a series of comments over certain UI elements just as a reference. To make this a little bit easier to read, behold, tell it to click the thing. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Something that's worth mentioning about this, we talked about how GUI scripting is susceptible to issues with user involvement, right? So if we're dealing in almost real time, users can do whatever they want to during that time. They can move windows around, they can open new things, they can quit certain things. Something unique about clicks is that it's a nested tell, right? We're not just talking to system events, we're talking to the specific process that we want to send this command to. And that means that this particular command will work on a window that is not your first responder. If the user's brought up something else in front of Word or in front of system settings, this click's still going to go through that and hit where it's supposed to hit. When you can use click commands, I would strongly recommend it because that extra level of resilience can make or break a workflow, right? Let's do something less fun. Sending a keystroke. We're going to start this off slightly differently because we're not talking to system events first. We're going to start by telling the application we need to be in front to get the heck in front, and that's this activate command. If the application's open, that just gives that application or process first responder status, bumps it up to the front, and then allows you to proceed. If your application is closed, this will invoke it. This will open it for you. I would probably recommend not relying on that because as we were talking about timing, well, how long is it going to take to load? Do we have a proper way to track that and make sure we don't proceed until we know that that window's available? We finish our first tell, and now we're going to tell system events to hold down the command key down the command key. We're going to send a single keystroke, which is the comma, and then we're going to release the command key. Please be good stewards of your modifier keys and release them when you are done. And so this will, obviously this brings Word to the front. This opens up preferences and lets us proceed from there. So this is a keystroke element that we're sending a single letter. Because, again, we've had the activate command go first, we know the correct window's in front, unless your user is very lucky and has a very fast trigger finger. You can also see how we could customize this very, very briefly, right? Switch it from poking at Microsoft Word, set it to Finder, and then switch it from Command comma to Command K. There we are at Connect to Server, right? If we need to send more than one letter, well, now we get to talk about text fields. And we're going to start this the same way as the previous one. We're going to activate the application we want to talk to. We're going to tell system events, excuse me, feeling good, that we are going to set a focused parameter of a text field, of a UI element that's in our window. We're going to set that focused value to true, and that's what's going to drop our cursor into that text field. We don't need to send a separate click for that. We can just set a focused value. To once again make this easier to read, because we all love the thing, we are setting focused of the thing to true. Okay? Once we have that down, we are sending a keystroke just as a basic string, right? We dump all the letters we need in there. You'll love to see it. We are then issuing a key code. And in this situation, key codes reflect all of the keys on your keyboard. Here's some of the ones you'll probably start with in some of your automation. Once we've sent that key code, that just pop, that hits our down arrow. We are then pressing and releasing the return key. And similarly, you could just send the key code for the return key if you wanted to. Because we've got these key codes, you can do all sorts of things with modifiers. In the previous example, all we did was hold the thing down and then release it. Obviously, that can get a little bit cumbersome if you need to hold down multiple modifier keys at once. So, option B is to send your key code using, and then get your curly braces out and just define all of them all at once. Right? So shift down, option down, command down. The nice thing about this is that since this isn't telling the OS to perpetually hold that down until I say to stop, these modifiers are just being used for that keystroke. Great, much easier to clean up. All right, we've identified our elements, we've got our nouns, we are going to verb set nouns, but now we have to deal with the reality of this kind of code, which is the fact that it does not exist in a vacuum. Dealing with timing is tricky, but it's not as cataclysmic as you might think. The most fundamental building block that I'm going to use for this, and as a full disclaimer, build this better than I've done it. We're going to start with a really simple check. If exists an element, if the element is present, act on the element. Well, right, straightforward. Again, to truncate, if exists the thing, do the thing. Okay? What does this actually look like in practice, and something that's a little bit more usable? We're going to start dealing with our repeat loops. So we are going to repeat 60 times if the system settings window exists, if there's any window for that app, right? And it's always going to start at 1 and enumerate from there. If that exists, we're going to give it 3 seconds to sort of fudge time, wiggle time to figure itself out. We're going to bail out of our repeat and keep going. If that window does not exist, we're going to pipe through a 1-second delay, and then let ourselves go through that loop one more time. So, behold, today's first timeout, right? Based on what you're going to be writing for and what you're automating against, your timeouts may, you might want to have something running for 15 minutes just in case. And you can also change your delay to figure out how frequently you're polling for the status of the element that you're trying to interact with. Once we've gone through that first loop, all right, either we've timed out and we've exited the repeat because the element's not there, or we found it, we gave it 3 seconds to figure itself out and then proceeded. We're once again checking to see if exists that window, our first window of system settings, just to cover our bases. If it's gone, we're out. Something's gone wrong. Either it's taken more than a minute, that's not a use case we're expecting, something else needs to happen with this machine, or the user just straight up closed the app. Okay, either way, we're done. And we're going to bail out of the script using error number -128. More on that shortly. Let us keep diving deeper into said shenanigans. So once again, truncating this because it's terrible to read. Still bad, but not quite as terrible. So once again, you can see at the start of this is now at the end of this workflow, we're trying to find that more info button. Give it a click. So we've got another repeat loop, checking 60 times. Does the button exist? If it does, give it a click. Great. Exit, repeat, we keep moving. If that button doesn't exist, if it's not caught by that first if statement, then we're going to send a half-second delay. So this is a 30-second timeout that polls more regularly to make sure that the user doesn't have too many options, because when they see things, they will want to click things. Then we finish up that repeat. Now, at the end of this is a little sloppy, but for context's sake, we've got that last 1 second delay before we exit things. If this times out, we just exit the repeat, or if system settings has been closed, we bail out because this was the end of our workflow anyways, right? There's not a lot to catch. There's not a lot to clean up. We just call it a day. So to summarize, define your timeouts. This is so unique to every single environment, and it's unique to your expected user experience, because some folks are going to get a little squirrely if they see things changing kind of slowly. They'll assume that system slowdown and then come to you with problems about that. And certain things just take so darn long anyways, even in ideal situations, that it's a total waste of time to have it polling every half second. Right? That doesn't help anyone. When you are exiting, or when you are bailing out, should a fail state be reached, remember this guy. Error number -128 is going to be roughly equivalent to a user hitting a GUI cancel button, and it just stops everything. It's like, we're done, we can call it a day, something's happened, and we need to get out of here. You can, of course, build in your own logging systems to this as needs be, if you need to be able to track that later. But this is really helpful to do, primarily to put yourself up for success so that you don't end up in a state where multiple iterations of this kind of script can run at the same time, because you are going to have a bad time with that, and users will too. If we run into conflicts with different applications being activated, and more importantly, keystrokes being sent to the computer instead of to a specific process, you're going to get some weird behavior. So, versioning. Since we're trying to do as little as possible in the GUI script, I would strongly recommend trying to keep this in whatever code you prefer. So if you can build this inside of a bash script and then invoke your Apple script afterwards, great. If you build this in a bash script and then have to open one of 3 separate Apple script applications, that's also still fine, right? But you keep it in the language you like. You can't always do that, and so we have to do some rudimentary version checks. So this is a really, really bare bones version checker. We are setting a variable we're calling OS major to a system attribute, which is sys1. Sys1 just kicks out your major build, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, et cetera. And we're just going to do some basic comparisons, right? If it's under 11, we don't want anything to do with it. Throw the error, get us out of Dodge. If it's Monterey or Big Sur, right? If it's lower than 13, great. We can then go into that logic and be sure to exit the script before we call it a day. And then any devices that didn't fall into those earlier categories, we're going to catch as being greater than 12. We've got our logic that we can proceed with there. Hoping it will not come up, but if you ever need it, sys1 is your major version, sys2 is your minor. So again, if you're in one of those unusual situations where you have to care about the minor version, you can use that comparison as well. You'll notice Apple Scripts, as I've been poking around with it, is oddly forgiving, which is a lovely change of pace. Doesn't really mind. You can see in the last comparison, we've got that thing in parens. It's fine. Doesn't need them, but it'll take them. So a little bit of wiggle room there, which I really appreciate. We've got that in place. If we are dealing with third-party applications, we can do the same kind of thing, assuming your third-party application is bundled in the way that we expect our apps to be bundled, right? So we're setting another variable to the version parameter of an application, keynote, great. And then we're going to log it instead of doing an echo, and there's our result. Now we can take that, feed it out to the rest of our script, or if this is just in the Apple script, you'll probably want to clean up some of the special characters and then do the comparisons that you're going to need to do. Aha. I'm talking fast. I see what I've done. We talked about this briefly at the beginning, but your delivery method. You can either embed this in your existing scripts, or you can kick out an application. Again, one big consideration for this is how complex your deployment environment is, and what sort of PPCs you have in place and you're planning to continue to update. If you're going in-house, I usually recommend starting just with the OSA script injection, because for a lot of things, especially if you're going to need to keep hitting the same application, you build the PPPC once. You can do anything you need to find your system settings or Word. Just keep rolling that. In the use case that we've been rolling with here for a little bit, which is, again, hitting that more info button in system settings, I wanted to add that to Nudge back before Nudge supported running scripts. And so I had to build it as an app. Cool thing about apps, though, is when you run them, especially if the user's never seen it before, it kind of does a thing. It pops up in the dock, and everyone panics. So I would recommend, if you're going to be putting your script into a standalone application, hiding the dock icon is definitely going to be worth your time. It doesn't take too terribly long, and it's going to save you some grief and possible calls to the desk. To do that, make sure when you export your application that you're exporting it as unsigned. We don't want to lock this thing down yet, so we got to still make some changes. Once you've exported that application, you're going to go into your info.plist, and we're going to add this key and define your application as an LSUI element. And this is the flag you're going to use to make sure that upon runtime, that application doesn't touch the dock, users none the wiser. They won't be able to track it down, force quit it, or anything like that. Once you've made that change, you can sign your application, get it into testing, and then eventually into production from there. For archival purposes, ta-da, everyone loves a sample code signing one-liner. And remember, if you don't have your dev certificate, go get one from developer.apple.com. Sign your apps. It's just polite, and it costs $100. When you do this, or at least as I have done this multiple times, an error I'm used to running into is after I plug in this command, terminal says, something's not right. There's attributes I don't expect to be connected to your files. This is incompatible, blah, blah, blah. And they should be there, because we did a thing to it. We edited this after AppleScript kicked the thing out for us, after Script Editor did its work. So you can use this command to flush out your extended attributes, which cleans up after the work we did manually editing those files. Try the signing again. It'll probably go through. Right? And of course, there's a million other things that can go right or wrong during this process, but this is a good one to just have in your tool belt. So let's pull some of these last things together. As we've discussed, if at all possible, because of the sheer amount of iterations you'll have to do of the GUI script part of your scripts, try to keep that section small. Because ideally, in a situation where we went from Monterey to Ventura, suddenly system preferences has a new name and a wildly different interface. But we've still got a single one-liner we can use to get us there, even though doing that exact same thing in the GUI script would be kind of a mess. So less things we have to control in every single version. As you are pulling UI elements from the applications you're working with, names are better than numbers, to the best of my knowledge. I did discover that with system settings and how software updates can be queued up, right? This is update now, update tomorrow, controls like that. those additional buttons can get drawn or removed from the interface, and suddenly all your targets have different numbers. And so controlling for those things can be kind of sticky. So if you have the option to use names, you'll have a better time of it. Clicks over keystrokes, again, because we don't care about first responder status. So user does something weird, we can still send the click where we need it to go to keep the rest of the workflow moving properly. Aha, I'm taking longer than next door. Yes. Consider user communication. Raise your hand if you play D&D. I love my players. They're the best murder hobos. Consider talking to your users, right? And there's a million ways to do this, but building a culture of what they expect from your branding and how you handle things is going to go a really long way. Because if they expect, oh, when I run something, I usually see this and then this, brilliant. In a situation like this, tell them what you're going to do. Set the expectation. Give yourself every opportunity to say, like, oh, you ran the script and it didn't work quite right. Did you read we sent you that warning to just let you know. Hands off, let the thing run. To be honest, almost as important, be sure to also send a notification when it's done. So the folks really know they get a clear indication your stuff's taken care of. You're set to go. It's going to be great. Anything else comes up, hit up the desk. We got you covered. Right? This particular notification is fully written in OSA script as well. And so you can use this, or of course, use the notifier of your choosing. We are drowning in them, and they're all spectacular, which is great. As you write these, I may also recommend, depending on the temperament of your users, including some consistency checks along the way. At what point you're downloading a 3 gig file before you deploy it, it's worth taking the extra couple seconds in your code to confirm, is this application still open? Is this window that I expect to be in front still in the front? Right? Just do those quick checks, remediate them if you can in line before you proceed. There are Apple script commands to get the names of windows that have first responder status or that are available in an application, and then you can set a window of a specific name to activate. You can pull that up, and make sure that you're delivering your commands to the right thing there. Beta participation, always do the things. And of course, the obvious answer here is for compatibility tests, right? Because as we saw with the jump to macOS 13, boy, howdy, a lot of stuff changed. And workflows might be different. Like navigation hierarchies can certainly be different. And even something as minor as if you have a developer, if there is an item when we're talking about OSs, that Apple has just moved a little bit in their hierarchy, it's definitely possible that the target could change. Number something different, your old script's not going to work. You have to control for that now. That being said, maybe there's also some new items in there, right? Maybe there's a different way to invoke something that allows you to cut some steps out. Great, we'll take advantage of that. And anything you can do to just keep paring this thing down so there's less and less moving parts during each execution, you're going to have a better time. The other really important thing for beta testing is the hope for obsolescence. In case anyone had forgotten, still a terrible idea. It is our goal as curators of GUI scripts to hope that with every release from a third-party developer or from Apple regarding the operating system, that we can retire this thing for good, that we finally got an MDM key for it. Great, we're done with this. It was a lovely time we will show at the door. Or there might be a new plist we can access. There might be some other command line way to get the same thing done and to get rid of the variables we can't control of what your users are doing when. And I mean, this tracks, right? Because back in the day, we were doing this in the other direction. We were starting with workflows like this and then finally being delighted that we could automate it in a different way. We could automate it with a more invisible hand. So that cycle just is always going to continue. Document in the universe. Document for 3 targets. Or I recommend 3 targets. Your mileage may vary. For yourself in 2 years when you do not recognize us on your bleary-eyed. And for any other developers working with you on the project, right? Document this for your other internal users, your employees, who are going to be related to this. If you're in an MSP environment, make sure your support desk knows why you wrote this and that you wrote it so they will actually use the darn thing. And then your third target's going to be for your public, for your actual end users. The information that should be included in your documentation for those 3 separate targets can be wildly different, and that's a very good thing. Users just need to know enough so that they can feel empowered and they can self-remediate. your team needs to know enough about how it works and, more importantly, why to use it and when to rely on that as a solution. And you need to be able to reverse engineer this for the next operating system so you can fix it up and keep it updated and running. Now, depending on your environment, you may or may not have the time and the resources to necessarily control for every single version of the operating system. If you've got a print client that keeps an entire room filled with unopened boxes of 2011 iMacs, not that I have a chip on my shoulder about it, because they cannot afford to pay the 60 grand they need to update their software. All right, we're controlling for 1013. Fine, you've got to make that happen. If you don't need to make that happen, there is no shame in saying this tool only works in Ventura and later. Sometimes you got to cut your losses. And you can have those folks that have those edge cases. You can still build the documentation, because what you do to set up your workflows here, back when we first started talking about this, you were designing your workflow based on working with an entry-level user. You've got that documentation, give it to your support desk. They've got the exact thing they need now to be able to handle that request without reinventing the wheel, or without you having to now go and test this on 14 different versions of macOS. And of course, most important takeaway for the day, say it with me, this is a terrible idea. Oh, man. All right. Bonus points if you get this reference. Dante, yeah, we're throwing down. Yeah. You'll love to see it. It's a glorious thing. Abandon your hope. Okay, useful things. PPPC utility, again, go get it. It's spectacular. It is not MDM specific. It's just another tool that Jamf has given the community, which is wonderful. Throughout the course of this Prezzo, I used SF symbols a lot. You're going to hear just more and more and more. If you're not using it yet, download it. It's free. It's wonderful and highly customizable. Allows you to get a lot of interface elements so you don't have to build them yourselves. And also because they're highly ingrained in the style guides for macOS. Right? No reason to reinvent the wheel with something if Apple's already given you an icon for it. Human interface guidelines, if you want to do any deeper reading about how Apple considers sort of their design Bible or philosophy about the operating system, really, really helpful stuff as far as figuring out how to navigate those UI element dumps. Get your developer cert if you need it. There's this cool little document from the Eastman reference that's just a list of all the key codes for all the keys on your keyboard. Great thing to keep in your pocket. And then the companion blog piece I wrote for this is my sudoaid GUI scripting with AppleScript document. That is available as well. Speaking of that, in a fit of lunacy, I may or may not have accidentally printed a boatload of sudoaid stickers. So if y'all want some stickers, and I'm not even selling anything, grab a sticker. They're great. They're orange. We love them. And with that, that takes us to Q&A. Questions, thoughts, concerns, awkward clapping? I'll take awkward clapping. All right. What have I done? Hey.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you kindly. Appreciate that.
Question, what are your thoughts on the criteria to use to determine whether you use AppleScript to do this or something like Automator or Shortcuts as those become more capable?
I would probably start out in those other interfaces. I feel like, especially Shortcuts, the methods that you can use for building these, it feels a little bit more intuitive. I ended up using the AppleScript route. I like to know how the sausage is made, and so I just had a better time digging into that. In a weird past life, I was a graphic designer, and so I love digging into how those style guides worked. This is a little more specific, and because I was going through it command by command, I felt like there was a lower probability of me guessing wrong about what any given task will do. There's also certain items, I only ran into this with system settings, but I can't vouch for where else they would be, where, as a fun for example, if you are working in Ventura, and you are writing something that is going to interact with system settings, and you're like, oh, I need to multi-purpose this back to system preferences as well. If you try to search for and save a string that says, oh, tell application system preferences, it'll actually switch that to system settings when you try to save. Every time you try to save. And so after I discovered that and kind of had a conniption, and thank you, Slack admin community, for talking me down from that last year, I decided it might be better for me to work with the devil I know rather than the devil I don't, because I don't know how those conflicts are resolved inside of shortcuts. I don't know what to do for that.
So when you have a mix of shell commands and Apple script, what's your tendency, or does it depend on the case? Build an Apple script app that happens to have shell codes in it, shell commands in it, or build a shell script that happens to call OSA script?
I tend to do as much work as I can in shell script, and because I cut my teeth on this building an external Apple script application instead of just running it just as a Apple script script, always weird to say. I've preferred to just do those little injections when I can, because it's more second nature for me to especially handle my output if the things are user interactive. So if I'm looking for different results from users clicking different buttons along the way, from interface elements that I throw, if I'm like, oh, I need your password so I can escrow a file vault key, keeping all of that in the language I'm more familiar with has tended to do well for me. And one thing that works out well for that, if you're still in an environment where you have one primary MDM and you're not juggling multiple MDMs and having to keep all those up to date, is that I can have a single GUI script PPPC that I push that's got the add a G agent and add a G binary in there, and I can just keep iterating on that and adding the additional apps that I need in a single spot, rather than adding multiple different applications. They both work. It's just whatever feels best.
So if I got anything from this presentation, I'm totally convinced that this should be option number 1 in my toolbox. So that aside, what's like the coolest thing that you think that you've ever done using this methodology, or the most useful thing that you've ever built with this?
Oh, geez. For me, the frustration of not, and if you know, please message me afterwards if you actually know the correct solution to this. But that stupid connect to servers bookmark thing, I can replace the file, but I have no idea how it's authored. There's so many weird characters, and I don't know how it's like low-key encrypted or how stuff's being written in there. But being able to just have a user configuration script in self-service, where when the support desk is setting up a machine for this specific client, they can just click a button and it goes through most of their setup tasks, changes the desktop background, pulls the stuff that it needs from there, does a lot of other user configuration things, docutil, stuff like that, pulls that in. But handling those additional bookmarks non-destructively has been something that I still do not fully understand why we can't do it. But this tool for that was probably the biggest one.
Just a couple of things. If you're going to do, especially with some of the returns coming out of like UI scripting, where you've got this and blah, 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 and you want to make sense of it, I cannot recommend high enough for anyone doing more than the minorest thing in AppleScript. Go to Late Night Software, get a copy of Script Debugger. It will make your life, well, for everything, not just UI scripting. You can also do AppleScript Objective-C in it. And if you're doing Apple scripts, it actually is a proper debugger. Like you can line by line breakpoint it, and it'll show you all your variables, what's going on, what's changed, that kind of thing. And so when you get those kind of things, the outputs where it's like tell of, it actually gives it to you in a sensible format.
Nice.
It also has a dictionary explorer, so you can go to a scriptable app and it will show you what that app is doing. If the app is running, it will show you what the live values for the dictionary stuff is. They also inherited a freeware tool written by Bill Cheeseman, who is an amazing force in the AppleScript world for decades, called UI Browser. And it's literally there to help you UI script easier. And it goes through an app, and it can see what you can actually UI browse. It gives you the correct terminology, makes it so much easier. And they've got that. They've got version 3 for free. And he was working on version 4 when he retired, gave it to Late Night Software. And that's available as an open source. If someone wants to finish it, they can.
That's awesome.
But those two things are, like, I've done stuff with, there's stuff I can't imagine that I would have been able to do without Script Debugger. Let's put it that way. Massive scripts. And it handles code signing, applications, the whole thing. The other final thing is for anyone using OsaScript, if you do a shebang in a shell script to OsaScript, you can just write straight AppleScript. You don't have to do the -e over and over and over. You can write as much as you want in a .sh script file, and it'll just pipe it all through the OsaScript executable and run it as AppleScript.
Nice.
And that's one that's been there from the start of OsaScript, but almost no one knows about it.
I am certainly someone in that
Yeah.
did not know about that. Thank you. Excellent recommendations. Appreciate it.
If you go to Late Night Software at Script Debugger, it's $100, but if you do anything more than like really quick 5-line Apple scripts, the debugger alone will pay for itself.
Dig it. Oh, here.
Is there a reason why this wouldn't work for like TCC stuff around like privacy? Because that's always a pain in the ass.
Technically, probably would. Does Apple want you doing that? Because like, that's where stuff sort of gets into the gray area. As a for example, and on that note, with this thing where we can click on more info, or we could, when we're pulling the software, we can actually click install. Well, maybe we could also click accept on the EULA. Technically, you can. But that might turn into a thing that gets a little bit of extra scrutiny. And when we're going into that realm of the universe, part of that is just going to be internal ethics and who's going to see this, who's going to audit it, who's going to look at it in that regards. Part of that could be like, hey, let's update our EULA with this client. That says by participating in our MDM and by being on our support services, you are authorizing our team to make these elections, make these privacy elections that are normally not available by default. And as long as everyone's on board and transparent and upfront about it, I could absolutely see that being a powerful use for this. With the asterisk of like, boy, I wonder what Apple would think about that.
Cool, thanks.
So I found out the hard way, you can't click on everything with this. There's certain things that Apple calls a synthetic click. And
Ooh.
in particular, if you've got Apple Remote Desktop and they have to click OK, you can't do it remotely.
Okay, good learn.
Yeah, it sucked.
Oh, man. We good? Oh. Yeah. Safety third.
So you used log a couple times. You never said where it went, but you might have mentioned that it's just like Echo. Is that correct?
That's how I've been using it.
Okay.
I'm sure there's an actual proper output location for that to live, but inside of Script Editor, if you log X, Y, or Z or log a variable, it'll just kick it out for you to review.
And another simple Googleable question that maybe other people have. You were using repeat. Is there no while command?
There probably is.
Okay.
I imagine there probably is. I ended up using the repeats simply so that I could control the two variables of how frequently does it poll and when do I want the timeout. I am certain there's more efficient ways to do that than what I did here. But basis for this was here is a method, almost certainly not the best method, but it gets you thinking about, to be honest, like the harder part for me for understanding this and using this sort of workflow were the soft skills. Because everyone here, 9 out of 10 of you can outcode me like right now. Blessings, you're spectacular. Because of my background and this other stuff that I've done, figuring out the soft skills of, all right, what is the user experience and expectation, and focusing on that thing, and then thinking about the UI elements. If you're used to writing back-end or shell scripting primarily and not user interface or front end, it's a different hat, it's a different mindset. And so these are some of the ways that you can approach the difficult part, which is pulling together what the workflow even should be in your environment, and then use your know-how and your resources to build a more efficient and more powerful way to run the actual thing, include those edge cases that you have to for the different versions, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, the repeats, it got the job done.
Yeah.
Thanks.
For logging perspective, does the system log or application log record any of the actions executed by the script?
I'm uncertain. I would have to get back to you on that. My gut says there's no way that it can't be, given how invasive this tool could be in the wrong hands. So I would certainly bloody well hope it does. But I haven't in my writing of the script and in its execution, haven't needed to dive into that really far yet. So excellent question. I'll see if I can look that up. Awkward pause. You'll love to see it. All right. With 5 minutes remaining, thank you so much for your time. Please feel free to grab a sticker if you'd like, and y'all take care.